On November 10th, Bolivia's first indigenous president, Evo Morales, was forced out of office by a right-wing military coup, organized by the Christian fascist oligarch Luis Fernando Camacho and backed by the good old US of A. Morales' home was ransacked, MAS party officials attacked, and their homes burned down, family members kidnapped and held hostage, and one socialist mayor dragged through the streets and tortured by a right-wing mob. This is just the most recent in a series of ongoing US-backed regime change operations happening throughout Latin America. In fact, US empire has been spreading democracy, aka meddling in the affairs of Latin America for centuries, usually on behalf of multinational corporate interests and usually by preventing left-wing democratically elected leaders from coming to power or deposing them once they're elected. From the 1893 overthrow of the Hawaiian monarchy to the 1954 CIA-backed ouster of Guatemalan President Jacobo Arbenz, to today, 2019, where just this year we saw not one, but two US-backed coups in the region, first in Venezuela and now Bolivia. The U.S. is determined to maintain its ideological and economic hegemony by any means necessary, despite its global decline. And unfortunately, the United States has had nearly 2 centuries to perfect its imperial tactics, beginning its conquests with overt military-backed hostile takeovers and, over time, shifting to more covert methods, like using the CIA to secretly train guerrilla fighters abroad, imposing sanctions on struggling economies, and after World War II, using organizations like the OECD, the IMF, and the World Bank to drown developing countries in debt and leave them dependent on Western institutions and governments for help. In fact, in 2008, WikiLeaks published what it called the U.S. Coup Manual, documenting Washington's unconventional warfare tactics, specifically referring to how the U.S. military uses global financial institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank to alter other countries' behavior using economic incentives and disincentives. By the way, until recently, former National Security Advisor and head of the NSC, John Bolton, was in charge of securing and controlling these financial incentives. John Bolton, you might remember, who said this about Venezuela.
Venezuela is one of the 3 countries I call the troika of tyranny. It'll make a big difference to the United States economically if we could have American oil companies really invest in and produce the oil capabilities in Venezuela.
Venezuela is just another example of recent U.S. meddling in the region and evidence of what some are calling Operation Condor 2.0, basically a resurgence of the Cold War-era campaign to combat communism by installing paramilitary death squads and conducting regime change operations across Latin America. Underlying this imperialist agenda is an ideology which centers the United States as the most advanced and civilized nation in the world, which touts the superiority of free markets and which constantly scapegoats the other in order to prop itself up. Part 1. The birth of American exceptionalism. Since its inception, the United States has used the ideology of American exceptionalism to explain away and justify its behavior at home and abroad. The mythology of manifest destiny, which asserted the United States' God-given right to expand its dominion across the continent, would be used to justify the violent conquest of indigenous lands and subsequent imperial expansion into Mexico. The Monroe Doctrine, which declared the United States the sole protector of the Western Hemisphere from European intervention, would be used to justify the overthrow of the Hawaiian monarchy in 1893, and 5 years later used to betray its Cuban allies in the Spanish-American War. And later on in 1904, the Roosevelt Corollary, otherwise known as the Big Stick Policy, would open the door for invasions to Nicaragua, Haiti, and Cuba, among others. All of these policies based on the sick ideology which says the United States is some benevolent actor on a civilizing mission, simply seeking to spread democracy and freedom to all. These civilizing missions abound in the first half of the 20th 20th century, but for our purposes today, I'd like to skip ahead to the 1960s and 1970s. It's here that we find ourselves entrenched in the Cold War, and a wave of socialist and nationalist movements begin to sweep across Latin America, threatening the power of local oligarchies as well as U.S. interests. What ensued in response was a U.S. state-sponsored terrorist program, a program which provided military, tactical, and financial support to military and paramilitary groups across the region, including Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, Bolivia, Paraguay, Brazil, and later Peru and Ecuador. Known as Operation Condor, repressive authoritarian regimes were installed in place of democratically elected civilian governments, and it happened over and over and over again across multiple administrations, including Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, and Reagan. Most of this support took place at U.S. military bases in Panama, including the notorious and absolutely horrifying School of the Americas, later renamed WINSEC. In operation since 1946, the School of the Americas is an infamous education center known for grooming and training military officers and coup plotters from all over Latin America. The SOA curriculum includes sniper training, military intelligence, psychological warfare, and interrogation tactics such as torture techniques, rape, and mass killings, all of which is sanctioned by the CIA and the U.S. Army. The manuals literally give interrogators step-by-step instructions on, quote, how to keep electric shock victims alive and responsive, and recommends dousing the victims' heads and bodies with salt water. Whew. The SOA is responsible for hundreds of thousands of deaths in Latin America, from Haiti to Honduras, training some of the region's most notorious criminals, including the Christian fascist dictator Rios Montt of Guatemala, who carried out the mass rape, torture, and genocide of tens of thousands of indigenous Mayan people using scorched earth tactics, all of which was backed by the U.S. government under Ronald Reagan, who said this about Montt.
President Rios Montt was a man of great personal integrity and commitment. I know he wants to improve the quality of life for all Guatemalans and to promote social justice. This was Ronald Reagan. This wasn't me. It's very embarrassing. Rios Montt was a dictator, and he was full of shit, and he did a lot of harm to Guatemala, so there's that, I guess.
Also making the list is drug trafficking dictator of Panama Manuel Noriega and Bolivian tyrant Hugo Banzer. According to human rights groups, Operation Condor was responsible for at least 60,000 deaths. It ushered in an era of military dictatorships along with neoliberal capitalist doctrine, which I want to talk a little bit about. Chile, a case study in neoliberalism. Throughout the 70s, Washington participated in extensive covert activity in Chile in order to prevent and then sabotage a Salvador Allende presidency. Fearing the spread of communism, the CIA organized multiple plots to bring down Allende, including bribery of high-ranking officials, the spread of anti-Allende, anti-communist propaganda, funding strikes, and ultimately propping up the military coup that overthrew Allende and brought Augusto Pinochet to power. Pinochet then dismantled Congress, banned all leftist parties, installed a military dictatorship, and then used the Chicago Boys to install a neoliberal regime. See, as part of their plan to counter Soviet ideology to Latin America, the United States invited 25 Chilean students to attend the University of Chicago to learn about neoliberal economics, studying under who better than Milton Friedman, one of the pioneers of neoliberal theory. These students, known as the Chicago Boys, then came home and gained employment in various South American governments, including the military dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet, where they basically engineered the complete neoliberalization of the economy. This meant privatizing dozens of state enterprises, deregulating financial and economic activity, and removing barriers to foreign imports, all of which was extremely beneficial to U.S. investments and horrible for the people. This became the first test case of neoliberalism in practice, and the U.S. would use this economic imperial blueprint over and over again against country after country after country in Latin America, and with the help of the IMF and the World Bank, would ultimately help to cripple the region financially, leading to the Latin American debt crisis. And this was basically the context under which the pink tide began to arise. After decades of being ravaged and impoverished by austerity, privatization, debt peonage, and military dictatorship, the people said no to neoliberalism and yes to social democracy. Beginning in Venezuela in 1999, Hugo Chavez, having inherited a country devastated by austerity and corruption, instituted what became known as Chavismo, or socialism of the 21st century. He nationalized key segments of the economy, most importantly oil, and used that money to help the poor, leading to unemployment being cut in half, infant mortality going down by 1/3, and extreme poverty going down by 2/3. Known as the Three Musketeers, Chavez, Lula da Silva of Brazil, inaugurated in 2003, and Evo Morales of Bolivia, inaugurated in 2006, were seen as the real initiators of the movement and really spit in the face of neoliberal doctrine and Washington consensus policies, which, as you can imagine, very much angered their U.S. counterparts. Also included in this pink wave was Argentina, Uruguay, Chile, Nicaragua, Ecuador, Paraguay, Peru, Costa Rica, and El Salvador. And since then, we've seen a systematic attempt by the United States to destabilize and, in fact, overthrow many of these governments, leading many to call this Operation Condor 2.0. We can point to the US-backed coup in Venezuela in 2002 and again in 2019, Haiti in 2004, Honduras in 2009, and most recently, Bolivia. Not to mention the recent attacks by the Trump administration against Nicaragua and Mexico. Now, Honduras and Bolivia aren't solely the doing of the United States, and it will actually probably be a long time before we know the full extent of US and CIA involvement in these coups. But we do know some. We know that President Obama and Hillary Clinton did everything in their power to support and justify Honduras's President Manuel Zelaya's ouster after he implemented a reform package which raised the minimum wage and enacted land reforms, and that they fully backed the right-wing military dictatorship that is to this day fraught with corruption and which regularly terrorizes its population. All of which, I might add, is largely responsible for the refugee crisis we currently find ourselves in. We also know that Hillary Clinton later bragged in her memoirs that she had, quote, rendered the question of Zelaya moot. And we know that Zelaya himself personally blames the US for their part in the coup. As for Bolivia, well, remember our talk about the School of Americas earlier? Well, it turns out that at least 6 of the primary coup plotters are in fact alumni of the SOA, including the military commander Williams Kalaman that requested Morales resign. Furthermore, Kalaman, along with the chief of police, both served as Bolivia's attachés in Washington, and other top commanders in Bolivia's police force participated in the Apala police exchange program, which we know Washington has used in the past to recruit officials for regime change ops. And that's exactly what happened here. The CIA, along with other spin-off agencies, including the National Endowment for Democracy and the United States Agency for International Development, have also funneled millions of dollars into opposition groups across Latin America, including the Santa Cruz Coordination Committee, which, surprise, surprise, is run by Christian fascist coup leader himself, Luis Camacho. Shout out to Chelsea Manning and Julian Assange, by the way, for uncovering and subsequently publishing the links between these two groups, both of whom, I should add, are now still serving time in jail for bullshit trumped-up charges. On top of that, we have the recently published leaked audio recordings showing a group of officials and opposition candidates laying out their plan to overthrow Morales, and among the names involved were Senators Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, and Bob Menendez. Oh, and of course, we can't forget the role that the Organization of American States played in legitimizing FAW concerns over the electoral process, citing inexplicable changes in the vote count. We know that this is bullshit, as the Center for Economic and Policy Research found no evidence of any irregularities and explained that the later jump in Morales' numbers that people were complaining about were due to late reporting rural and indigenous precincts, which have historically backed Morales anyways. Nonetheless, the OAS then conducted a partial audit, reiterating accusations of fraud, but provided no data which could be independently verified. Protesters and opposition leaders, along with the U.S. state, of course, cried foul, with no evidence backing that up. And instead of calling for new elections, which Morales agreed to, by the way, they instead demanded his ouster. How anyone could think this is fair or reasonable or democratic is beyond me. But of course, that's not the point, right? The OAS isn't interested in free and fair elections. It's a U.S. puppet platform interested in providing cover for Washington's imperial interests. In fact, the U.S. provides 60% of the organization's annual budget, and OAS Secretary General Luis Almagro has openly supported U.S.-backed regime change in leftist-governed nations, while blatantly disregarding human rights abuses in right-wing ones. For example, supporting the coup against Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela and the self-appointment of right-wing shill Juan Guaido, and then doing nothing when it came to the brutal repression of protesters in Ecuador, which left hundreds dead, wounded, or detained. By the way, if you want to learn more about the Bolivian coup in particular, I highly recommend checking out The Gray Zone, and particularly the reporting of Max Blumenthal, especially if you only speak English like I do, along with Bad Empanada's videos on the topic, which I will link below. Part 2, Manufacturing Consent, a Propaganda Model. So the final piece to this puzzle lies at the heart of what makes U.S. citizens believe our foreign policy is justified and even necessary. In Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman's 1988 masterpiece, Manufacturing Consent, they lay out a compelling case arguing that the U.S. media is not in fact some purely impartial arbiter and disseminator of information, but in fact a clearly biased actor, actively promoting a corporate-sponsored narrative and shaping public opinion to support the status quo with undying loyalty. As U.S. citizens, we're taught to believe that good old benevolent Uncle Sam is always looking out for our best interest, that our country's actions overseas are always justified, and that those other people, those other countries, are the problem. We're just trying to help them, democratize them, civilize them. And every mainstream media outlet tells us this is so. According to Chomsky's propaganda model, corporate media outlets, quote, achieve uniform opinions through the pre-selection of right-thinking editors and reporters who have been trained at the right schools. They then disseminate information, or at the very least self-censor, in a way that protects or advances the ideology of ownership, advisors, and official sources. In their book, Chomsky and Herman demonstrate the way this works by comparing media coverage of elections in Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua. Although the 1982 elections in Guatemala and the 1984 elections in Honduras were both held under, quote, conditions of severe ongoing state terror against the civilian population, U.S. media largely ignored the human rights abuses and blatant disregard for the civilian population because Honduras and Guatemala were considered client states of the U.S. at the time. Contrast this with the coverage of the 1984 Nicaraguan elections, where the socialist Sandinistas were elected fair and square, and we see hostile reporting and hysterical accusations of a, quote, Soviet-style sham election. The New York Times blasting the Sandinistas, who won 67% of the vote for, quote, refusing to subject their power to the consent of the Nicaraguan people. This, despite nearly all independent observers declaring these possibly the freest and fairest elections in Nicaraguan history. This is just one example among many of the ways in which mainstream media manufactures a distorted reality, one which is always sympathetic to U.S. interests, multinational corporations, and U.S. client states, and which actively seeks to undermine and defame its adversaries. It's been over 30 years since Chomsky and Herman released their book, and their thesis still holds true. In fact, in 2018, Alan McLeod tested the propaganda model again, comparing Western media coverage of the 2018 Colombian elections with the Venezuelan elections. With Colombia being a strategic ally of the U.S., we would expect the propaganda model to show favorable reporting of the region coming from Western media. And conversely, with Venezuela being a staunch adversary, we would expect just the opposite, aka accusations of a rigged election by an authoritarian regime. And that's exactly what happened. The 2018 Colombian elections were said to have been the most violent since 2006, when President Alvaro Uribe massacred over 10,000 civilians and far-right death squads coerced civilians into voting for their people. Left-wing candidates Gustavo Petro luckily survived an assassination attempt that was barely mentioned in the news, while right-wing paramilitary groups issued threats against those attempting to vote for him. American election observers, mistaken as voters, were offered bribes to vote for conservative candidate Ivan Duque, who, by the way, ended up winning, of course, and over 250 electoral fraud complaints were recorded. Despite all this, corporate mainstream media unapologetically endorsed the legitimacy of these elections, with CNN downplaying the violence and the Associated Press essentially endorsing Ivan Duque, warning that the left-wing candidate Gustavo Petro would, quote, push the country dangerously to the left. When NPR discussed previous President Alvaro Uribe, they completely failed to mention his 10,000 people massacre, and instead referred to him as immensely popular. Contrast this with the coverage of Venezuela, where mainstream media conglomerates across the board treated the elections as, quote, fraudulent, heavily rigged, and a farce cementing autocracy. Of course, this narrative flies in the face of the facts, and 150 international observers from over 30 countries, including the ex-president of Ecuador, Rafael Correa, and former Spanish Prime Minister Jose Zapatero, who stated he had no doubts in the very advanced voting system. Similarly, the way the Bolivian election was framed was equally dishonest, with corporate media refusing to call Morales' ouster a coup. CBS, for instance, suggesting Morales, quote, resigned because of election fraud and protests. Or the New York Times claiming he stepped down amid weeks of protests by an infuriated population that accused him of undermining democracy. Not to mention the countless bot accounts that popped up all over social media to spread misinformation campaigns. All in all, I think understanding the way that corporate Western media frames current events and really distorts reality to create very specific narratives is extremely important and useful. And even more specifically, understanding the way the United States in particular uses its various interlinking institutions, from schools to the media, to shape public opinion and to tell a story about itself. Using what Roberto Servant and Danny Haipong called the twin ideologies of American innocence and American exceptionalism, the United States is able to impose its hegemony upon the world while playing itself off as the benevolent civilizer. And it's able to justify its past horrors and imperial conquests as simply mistakes or aberrations, while demonizing its opponents as inherently evil. As Servant and Haipong write,
American innocence has us remember slavery and settler colonialism as events of the past, not as structures of domination that haunt our future. It has us view our violent overthrows of democratically elected leaders around the globe as mere aberrations of what we truly represent as a country, or as unfortunate transitional developments on the way to full-fledged liberal democracy. American innocence has us view the Iraq War as a simple mistake. It has us view Abraham Lincoln as the one who freed the slaves. It tells us that our laws are neutral, that our police serve and protect, and that our military fights for our rights. It tells us that everyone can make it in this country if they just work hard enough. It tells us that our history, like every other nation's, is a mixed bag, so it's time to move on. In short, the ideological work of American innocence is to remind us of the pure, benevolent intentions behind our imperial and genocidal actions, while at the same time assigning the most impure and evil motives to the violence of others. In other words, Martin Luther King might have been right that the United States is the world's greatest perpetrator of violence, but at least we always mean well.
I think that sums it up pretty well, so I'm just going to leave it there. If you like this video, then I highly recommend heading over to Radical Reviewer's channel, where he goes into much more detail about all of the US-backed coups in Latin America, providing an in-depth summary of the past 100 and some years of US intervention in the region. It's really well-researched and well put together, and our two videos really go nicely together, so make sure you head over there and give that pup some love. Anyways, thanks so much for watching. If you like this video, feel free to give it a like, share, subscribe, and hit that bell notification so you're notified when I post new vids. And finally, I really want to thank my patrons, without whom I literally could not be doing this work. So huge shout out to Torpid, PD Morin, Catherine, Chrissy Ta, Nicholas Glennon, Vegan Vanguard, Hugh Laurie, Kelly Zahos, Ricardo Patinga, Andy Haywood, Tom T, DG, Unkind Granola, Acorn, Rosengard, Mr. Bassa, Gazetas, Shannon Carroll, Marie Madrego, Lefty Techie, and a huge shout out to a son of a bitch, Magnus Claes, Polson Kramer, and Peter Sterling. And to all of my other patrons, you guys are awesome. Thank you so much. Bye.